I'd like everyone to meet Melissa, my mother-in-law Eleanor announced, her voice carrying across the private dining room of the Riverview. She placed her bejeweled hand on the shoulder of a young woman who couldn't have been more than 30. Daniel has been mentoring her at the hotel, and we all agree she has the perfect qualities to be part of our family business. And our family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne flute froze halfway to my lips as I processed her words. My husband Daniel sat beside his mother, his expression a mixture of discomfort and resignation. 8 years of marriage, and this was how we were celebrating our anniversary. With my mother-in-law orchestrating what appeared to be my replacement in both business and perhaps more. She understands the hospitality industry in ways that some people never will. Eleanor continued, her eyes fixed on me with unmistakable disdain. The Chen hotels deserve someone with true vision, don't they, Daniel? The polite smiles of the other guests, mostly Daniel's family and colleagues from the flagship Harrington Hotel in Seattle, where he'd recently been appointed manager, had frozen in place. Melissa, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer dress, managed to look both triumphant and embarrassed simultaneously. I sat paralyzed, the small gift box containing the vintage watch I'd had restored for Daniel still hidden in my purse. The watch had belonged to his grandfather, who had started the original Chen family restaurant decades ago, before Eleanor had married into money and developed grander ambitions. Daniel had mentioned missing it months ago, and I'd spent weeks tracking it down through distant relatives. There's a distinct sound when crystal champagne flutes stop clinking, when forks pause mid-air, when polite conversation evaporates. For 7 excruciating seconds, the only noise in our private dining room was the distant murmur of the main restaurant beyond the double doors and the soft piano music floating from hidden speakers. Melissa has been such an asset, Eleanor continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension. With her hotel management experience and fresh perspective, she's already identified several opportunities at the Seattle location that others have missed. Her gaze lingered pointedly on me. The implication was clear. I, the quiet, reserved daughter-in-law who had never quite met Eleanor's expectations, was being phased out. In Eleanor's eyes, I had never been good enough for her son or for involvement in what she still insisted on calling the Chen family business, despite the fact that the single hotel Daniel managed was actually part of the Harrington Hotels chain. Melissa finally spoke, her voice sweet with practiced charm. It's an honor to be welcomed so warmly by the Chen family. Daniel has taught me so much already. Her hand brushed my husband's arm with familiar ease. Some people are just natural leaders in this industry. I felt the weight of every gaze in the room. The pity, the curiosity, the anticipation of how I would respond. Eleanor had calculated everything perfectly: the public setting, the audience of family members and hotel staff, the timing on what should have been a celebration of our marriage. She knew I wouldn't make a scene. In 8 years, as Daniel's wife, I had never once contradicted his mother publicly. Liv? Daniel's voice broke through my thoughts. He only called me Liv at home, preferring the more formal Olivia in public to satisfy his mother's sense of propriety. You're being very quiet. Something shifted inside me then, a tectonic plate moving after years of pressure. The elegant restaurant with its sweeping views of Elliott Bay and the Seattle skyline seemed to recede around me. I reached for my water glass, buying time as I considered my options. The cool crystal against my fingers anchored me to the moment. Eleanor expected tears perhaps, or awkward acceptance, or even an undignified outburst that would only confirm her assessment of me as unsuitable for her son and his career. Instead, I smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes, the kind I'd perfected in countless corporate meetings where I was underestimated. What a thoughtful anniversary surprise, Eleanor, I said, my voice steady. Though I confess, I'm a bit confused about Melissa's role. Is she being groomed as Daniel's assistant manager? Or did you have something more personal in mind? Daniel's cousin Grace choked slightly on her champagne. Her husband Thomas suddenly found the pattern on his dinner plate fascinating. Olivia! Eleanor's voice carried a warning. Don't be crude. Melissa is a hospitality consultant with excellent credentials. Daniel has been working closely with her on the new renovation plans for the Seattle hotel. How closely? I asked, taking a deliberate sip of water. Close enough to justify missing our dinner reservations 3 times last month? Or perhaps that explains the room charges at the Portland Harrington that appeared on our credit card for meetings that weren't on your official schedule. I turned to Daniel, whose face had drained of color. Liv, this isn't the place. Daniel started. No? I placed my napkin carefully beside my untouched dinner plate. I thought this was exactly the place, since your mother chose our anniversary dinner to introduce your protégé. Eleanor's perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together. I don't appreciate your tone, Olivia. This is about business, the Chen family legacy that you've never shown proper interest in. While you've been playing with your little charity projects and women's business meetings, Daniel has been working to secure his future. The irony of her statement was almost painful. If only she knew about my little charity projects and women's business meetings. I think we should all enjoy this lovely dinner, Daniel said with forced lightness, turning to address the table. After all, we're celebrating multiple occasions, our anniversary and the upcoming renovation of the Seattle Harrington. He raised his glass in a desperate attempt to reset the conversation. Conversations resumed awkwardly around the table, everyone too uncomfortable or too polite to acknowledge what had just transpired. I sat motionless, food untouched, my mind racing beyond the humiliation of the moment to something colder and more calculated. What Eleanor didn't know, what she had never bothered to discover during the 8 years I'd been married to her son, was exactly what my charity projects and women's business meetings entailed. She had assumed, as had Daniel, in recent years, that I was merely occupying myself with meaningless activities while supporting his career from the sidelines. The truth was considerably more interesting. I excused myself to the restroom, walking with deliberate steadiness through the restaurant. Only when the heavy door closed behind me did I allow my hands to shake. I gripped the marble countertop, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back seemed like a stranger. Carefully applied makeup, hair styled in the conservative way Eleanor preferred, wearing the pearl necklace Daniel had given me for Christmas at his mother's. Suggestion. All the external trappings of the role I'd been playing. The perfect, unobtrusive Chen daughter-in-law. Are you all right? I hadn't noticed someone emerging from one of the stalls. Grace, Daniel's cousin, her eyes filled with genuine concern, rather than the pity I'd seen from others. Perfect, I said, reaching for a paper towel with trembling fingers. Nothing like being publicly discarded on your anniversary to build character. Grace's mouth tightened. Eleanor has always been controlling, but this, she shook her head. Bringing that woman to your anniversary dinner is just cruel. I laughed without humor. Eleanor has always excelled at cruelty disguised as family business. Olivia, Grace hesitated, her voice lowering. Thomas mentioned you gave him some investment advice last year for his startup. He said you understand the hotel industry better than anyone he's met. If you ever wanted to do something with that knowledge. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Here was Grace offering me a professional lifeline minutes after I'd been humiliated in front of her. What she didn't know, what almost no one knew, was how unnecessary her offer was. Thank you, Grace. That's very kind, I said, reapplying my lipstick with steady hands. But I think I'll be just fine. She nodded, seeming to understand that further conversation wasn't welcome. As the door closed behind her, I allowed myself 30 seconds, counting each one silently, to feel the full force of what had just happened. The betrayal, the humiliation, the calculated cruelty of Eleanor's timing and method. Then I straightened my shoulders and made a decision. Eleanor had orchestrated tonight as the beginning of my exit from the Chen family, with an audience to witness my humiliation. But she had miscalculated severely. This wasn't my ending. It was merely the beginning of something she couldn't possibly anticipate. I took out my phone and made a brief call. "Tara, it's Liv. Remember that contingency plan we discussed? It's time." I paused, listening to her response. "Yes, everything. And Tara, I want to be in the office tomorrow morning. It's time everyone knew who actually owns Harrington Hotels." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted to Daniel's plans for the Seattle hotel renovation. He was explaining, with practiced modesty, how the Harrington corporate office had given him unprecedented control over the project. "They've essentially granted me complete authority over the redesign," he was saying as I slid back into my seat. "The CEO apparently trusts my vision implicitly." "How fascinating," I commented, picking up my fork to sample the now cold dinner. "And have you met this mysterious CEO yet? I understand they're quite particular about their flagship properties." Daniel looked momentarily irritated at the interruption. "Not yet. Apparently they're traveling extensively. I'll meet them next week at the company retreat at Cascade Lodge." "That must be exciting for you," I said mildly. "Your first leadership retreat as hotel manager," Eleanor cut in. "Daniel deserves this recognition. I always said he was meant for greater things than just following the usual corporate ladder. The Chen family has hospitality in their blood." She turned to Melissa. "Daniel's grandfather started with a single restaurant, you know. Now look where we are." I bit back the correction that wanted to escape. The Chen family had indeed owned a successful restaurant decades ago, but they had no connection whatsoever to Harrington Hotels beyond Daniel's recently acquired position as manager of the Seattle location, a position he believed he'd earned through merit alone. "To Daniel's success," I said instead, raising my glass in a toast that everyone eagerly joined, grateful for the semblance of harmony. I sat quietly for the remainder of the dinner, observing my husband in his element, commanding attention, dropping hints about exclusive plans, positioning himself as indispensable to the Harrington brand. Melissa hung on his every word, playing her role perfectly. The adoring, impressed protégé, occasionally shooting glances in my direction that mixed triumph with pity. Little did either of them know that in exactly 7 days, at the Harrington Hotel's leadership retreat at Cascade Lodge, Daniel would come face to face with the founder and CEO of the company that had recently hired him, the woman whose business acumen had built Harrington Hotels from a single boutique location into one of the most respected independent hotel chains on the West Coast. The woman whose name was on his paychecks, the woman his mother had just suggested replacing at their anniversary dinner. As the evening mercifully drew to a close, I noticed Daniel and Melissa carefully maintaining distance between them, though their earlier comfort with each other told a different story. Eleanor made a show of inviting me to her Sunday brunch the following weekend, a transparent attempt to pretend the evening's humiliation had been merely business as usual. "I'm afraid I'll be tied up with meetings," I said. "But thank you for the invitation." Eleanor's lips pursed in disapproval. "More of your little projects? You know, Olivia, if you showed half as much interest in Daniel's career as you do in these hobbies of yours, you might be more valuable to this family." 8 years of biting my tongue in the face of such comments had left me with perfect teeth, marks on the inside of my cheek. Tonight, I simply smiled. "We all contribute value in different ways, Eleanor." I gathered my purse and stood. I look forward to seeing what the coming week brings for all of us. As Daniel made arrangements to see his mother and Melissa safely to their cars, I slipped away, texting my driver to meet me at the side entrance. The Seattle night was cool and clear, the lights of the city reflecting off the bay in a glittering display that usually brought me peace. Tonight, they seemed to mirror my newfound clarity. For years, I had kept my professional life completely separate from my marriage. I had built something significant while maintaining the facade that Daniel and his family needed. The supportive, unassuming wife who posed no threat to their egos or their narrative of familial success. That facade had served its purpose. Now, watching my driver approach, I realized it was time to let it fall away completely. Eleanor had orchestrated tonight as her opening move in a carefully planned game to reshape her son's life more to her liking, complete with a new, more suitable partner who would reflect her ambitions for him. What she didn't realize was that she had also freed me from any obligation to protect her or Daniel from the truth. As I settled into the back seat of the car, I opened my calendar app and sent a brief message to my executive team. Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Subject: Seattle Harrington Management Structure. Particular focus on the general manager position. For the first time in years, I felt the stirring of something I had almost forgotten, the satisfaction of finally bringing my complete self into the light. Eleanor and Daniel had always been so concerned with appearances, with how things looked to others. In 7 days, they would learn just how deceiving appearances could be. The game they thought they were playing was only just beginning. And I was about to change all the rules. The sleek glass tower of Harrington Hotel's corporate headquarters stood 40 stories above downtown Seattle, its distinctive curved architecture reflecting the morning light across Elliott Bay. I swiped my keycard at the private elevator, the one that bypassed the main reception area and led directly to the executive floor. The security guard nodded with familiar respect. "Good morning, Ms. Harrington. The team is assembled in the boardroom." "Thank you, Marcus. How's Sophia doing at Stanford?" His face brightened immediately. "Made the dean's list again. That scholarship program you established changed everything for her." These small human connections, knowing my employees, their families, their dreams, had always been central to my business philosophy. While Daniel networked strategically, cultivating only relationships that benefited his advancement, I built genuine connections throughout every level of my organization. The executive floor was already humming with activity despite the early hour. My administrative director, Priya, intercepted me before I reached the boardroom, tablet in hand and concern in her eyes. "The team's waiting, and I've drafted the memo about the Seattle property management changes for your approval. Will you be taking meetings as Olivia Chen or—" She hesitated. "As yourself today?" "As myself," I replied without hesitation. "Just myself. The distinction ends today." Priya nodded, relief flashing across her features. Maintaining my separate identities had complicated operations for my inner circle, requiring elaborate scheduling arrangements and careful communication protocols. "And Daniel? Do you want us to prepare for his reaction when he learns—" "He won't learn anything until the retreat," I said. "Today is about preparing the company for that revelation, not about him." The boardroom fell silent as I entered, 12 faces turning toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. My executive team, the carefully selected leaders who had helped build Harrington Hotels from a single boutique property into a respected chain of 32 locations, were among the few who knew both sides of my life. Tara Wilson, my COO and oldest friend, rose from her chair. "Good morning, everyone. As you've likely heard, we're navigating an unusual situation." She glanced at me, silently offering the floor. I placed my portfolio on the polished table and remained standing, wanting the clarity of this moment to be absolute. "Last night, my mother-in-law publicly ended my marriage," I said, my voice steady. "My husband has been the general manager of our Seattle property for 6 months, a position he believes was offered to him based solely on his qualifications and industry experience." A ripple of uncomfortable recognition moved through the room. Those who knew Daniel professionally exchanged glances of understanding. Those who had met him socially at company functions where I'd introduced him simply as my husband watched me with new awareness. That meeting is scheduled for the leadership retreat next week, I continued. Until then, we will proceed with absolute professionalism. Harold Jenkins, our 72-year-old board chairman who had been my first investor and mentor, cleared his throat. To be clear, you want us to treat Daniel exactly as we would any hotel manager, with no indication of his personal connection to you? Precisely, I confirmed. Daniel will be evaluated solely on his professional merits. His personal choices and his mother's machinations are irrelevant to his performance here. And when he discovers your position? This from Layla Patel, our sharp general counsel, already anticipating potential legal complications. He'll be given the same options as any executive in his position: adapt to the organizational structure or seek opportunities elsewhere. I surveyed the faces around the table, reading the unasked questions in their expressions. I understand this creates an unusual dynamic. To address the obvious concern, my personal situation will not influence company decisions. Daniel was hired because our Seattle location needed new leadership. That hasn't changed. What remained unspoken, but understood by everyone in the room, was that Daniel would now have to succeed or fail entirely on his own merits, without the invisible advantages my influence had previously provided. The playing field hadn't been tilted against him. It had simply been leveled. Now, I continued, shifting to business mode, let's discuss the Cascade retreat planning. Tara, where do we stand with the agenda? The meeting proceeded efficiently, covering quarterly projections, strategic initiatives, and pressing operational concerns. Throughout the discussion, I felt a growing sense of integration, the artificial barrier between my personal and professional identities dissolving with each minute. This was who I had always been: decisive, strategic, engaged with both the human and financial aspects of business. The performance had been my role as Daniel's wife, not my role as CEO. As the executive team filed out at the meeting's conclusion, Harold lingered behind, his eyes thoughtful beneath bushy white eyebrows. I've watched you build this company. For 10 years, he said once we were alone. Seen you handle economic downturns, competitor challenges, and expansion growing pains without breaking stride, but I've never seen you like this. Like what? I asked, gathering my notes. Fully present, he replied simply. There's always been a part of you held in reserve, watching the exits. Now it's like seeing you in complete focus for the first time. His observation startled me with its accuracy. I had always maintained a certain distance, not just from Daniel and his family, but from everyone in my life. The necessity of maintaining. Separate identities had created a habit of partial presence, of keeping something held back. Last night changed things, I acknowledged. When someone tries to publicly diminish you, it clarifies what you're no longer willing to diminish in yourself. Harold nodded thoughtfully. For what it's worth, I always hoped you'd eventually find a partner who could celebrate what you've built, not compete with it or remain oblivious to it. Daniel seemed... He paused, choosing his words carefully. More concerned with appearing successful than with creating actual value. The assessment was both kind and devastatingly accurate. Daniel had pursued the trappings of success, the prestigious address, the social connections, the beautiful wife, while I had focused on building something of lasting significance. Our fundamental values had always been misaligned, a reality I had ignored for the sake of convenience and what I'd once mistaken for love. What will you do after the retreat? Harold asked. Once everything is in the open? I considered the question, realizing I hadn't thought beyond the revelation itself. Rebuild, I said finally, but this time without dividing myself in half to make it work. After Harold left, I walked to the window of the empty boardroom, gazing out at the Seattle skyline. From 40 stories up, the city appeared as a living organism, each building, street, and moving vehicle part of an interconnected system. I had always viewed my life similarly, as a complex network of relationships, obligations, and strategic positions that required constant management. What would it mean to simplify that system? To no longer navigate between Olivia Chen and Olivia Harrington, wife and CEO, supportive partner and industry leader. My phone vibrated with an incoming text from Daniel. Meeting with design firm. Running late. Don't wait up. Order in if you're hungry. The casual dismissiveness of it, the assumption that I would simply be waiting at home for him while he worked late, possibly with Melissa, sparked something between amusement and indignation. For a moment, I imagined responding with the truth. Actually, I'll be reviewing quarterly reports and preparing for next week's leadership retreat where you'll discover I'm your boss. Instead, I simply wrote, "Enjoy your meeting." His response came seconds later. "Mom wants to know if you've reconsidered Sunday brunch. Says she wants to clear the air after last night." Clear the air. As if her orchestrated humiliation of me had been a minor social faux pas, rather than a calculated attempt to begin my replacement. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Eleanor Chen would have to wait until after the retreat for any response from me. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Tara entered with a tablet in hand and a concerned expression. "The all-staff email about the leadership reorganization is ready for your approval," she said, offering me the device. "We'll send it at noon if you're satisfied with the wording." I reviewed the message, a straightforward announcement that Olivia Harrington, founder and CEO of Harrington Hotels, would be taking a more active role in West Coast operations, beginning with the Seattle property. The language was professional and unremarkable, noting that I would be formally meeting with all property managers at next week's leadership retreat. No photo was included, no personal details offered, nothing that would alert Daniel to the storm approaching on his horizon. "Send it," I said, handing back the tablet. "And Tara, please have the Seattle property's performance reports on my desk by the end of day. All of them, not just the summary Daniel has been submitting to corporate." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "You think he's been selectively reporting?" "Almost certainly. It's what he's always done. Highlight wins, bury problems, take credit for team successes while distancing himself from failures. I've watched him do it for years in other contexts." I smiled without humor. "It's actually been quite educational, observing his tactics up close. It's made me a better executive, knowing how to recognize similar patterns in our organization." "And yet you hired him," Tara observed, her tone carefully neutral. "I approved his hire," I corrected. "His resume and interview performance were genuinely impressive. I wanted to see what he could actually accomplish when evaluated on merit alone, without—" I hesitated. "Without you smoothing his path?" Tara finished. "Exactly." The truth was uncomfortable but important. "I need to know if he's actually good at his job, Tara. Not for personal reasons, but because he's running our flagship property." She nodded, understanding the distinction. "And Melissa? The woman your mother-in-law introduced last night? Look into her as well. If she's actually qualified as a hospitality consultant, we should know exactly what she's been advising Daniel to do with our hotel." As Tara left to fulfill these requests, I turned back to the window, watching the ferry boats cross Elliott Bay with practiced precision. For 8 years, I had maintained the illusion that my business acumen was merely a hobby, that my frequent meetings and early morning calls were for charitable organizations rather than multi-million-dollar hotel developments. Daniel had never questioned this fiction, never wondered how I could offer such incisive advice when he discussed industry challenges, never asked about the source of the family money that had purchased our waterfront home, a home that he believed we had secured through his banking connections, but which I had bought outright years before meeting him. His lack of curiosity about my life had once seemed like a blessing, allowing me to build my company while maintaining a conventional marriage. Now it felt like evidence of a fundamental failure, not just his failure to truly see me, but my failure to demand being seen. The afternoon unfolded with a series of meetings and decisions, each one moving me closer to the integrated identity I was finally embracing. I approved the plans for our new Portland location, reviewed the sustainability initiatives being implemented across all properties, and signed off on the final agenda for the leadership retreat. At precisely noon, the company-wide email went out to every Harrington employee, including the newly appointed general manager of the Seattle property. Daniel would read it with the casual disinterest he afforded all corporate communications that didn't directly mention him. He might note the CEO's name without recognition, might even mentally prepare some strategy for impressing this Olivia Harrington when they eventually met. What he couldn't possibly prepare for was the moment, 7 days from now, when he would walk into the leadership retreat and discover that the wife his mother had so publicly diminished and the boss he so desperately needed to impress were one and the same. At 4 o'clock, Priya brought in the Seattle performance reports Tara had compiled. I spent the next 2 hours absorbing every detail, from occupancy rates and customer satisfaction scores to staff turnover and operational costs. The picture that emerged was complex, but clear. Daniel had indeed been selectively reporting to corporate, highlighting areas where the hotel excelled while downplaying concerning trends in staff satisfaction and maintenance issues. It wasn't outright deception, just the careful curation of information to present himself in the most favorable light possible. I recognized the strategy immediately. It was the same approach he had taken throughout our marriage, emphasizing his successes while dismissing setbacks as temporary anomalies or external factors beyond his control. More concerning were the renovation plans he had begun implementing, plans that emphasized flashy cosmetic changes to public areas while deferring crucial infrastructure updates. It was a perfect metaphor for Daniel himself, prioritizing appearances over substance, immediate impression over long-term stability. By 7 o'clock, the executive floor had emptied, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that the coming revelation would be professionally necessary beyond any personal considerations. The Seattle property needed more substantive leadership, focused on fundamentals rather than facades. My phone rang, Daniel calling, probably to inform me he would be even later than expected. I let it go to voicemail, not trusting myself to maintain the pretense of the dutiful wife waiting at home. A text followed moments later. Working dinner with Melissa and design team. Don't wait up. Important breakthrough on renovation concept. I set the phone aside and gathered the performance reports into my portfolio. Tomorrow would bring another day of preparation, another step toward the revelation that would forever alter both my marriage and Daniel's career. As I rode the private elevator down to the parking garage, I found myself reflecting on the curious liberation of impending truth. For years, I had carried the weight of my dual identity like a second skin, so accustomed to its constraints that I had stopped noticing them. Now, as that skin prepared to shed, I felt both vulnerable and strangely powerful, no longer divided against myself for someone else's comfort. My driver, Anthony, waited beside the car, opening the door with professional courtesy as I approached. "Home, Ms. Harrington?" I paused, suddenly resistant to the idea of returning to the empty house I shared with Daniel, a house filled with furniture and art selected to project the image he wanted, not to reflect the person I actually was. "No," I decided. "Take me to the Belltown apartment." The apartment I maintained under my own name had been my refuge for years, the place where I transformed from Olivia Chen, Daniel's supportive wife, into Olivia Harrington, CEO. Its necessity would soon end, but tonight I needed the comfort of a space that was entirely mine, uncompromised by the performance of my marriage. As we drove through the city, lights blurring past the car windows, I opened my tablet to review the final preparations for the leadership retreat. The schedule had been carefully crafted, welcoming dinner Sunday evening, opening session Monday morning featuring my formal introduction as CEO to those property managers who hadn't yet worked directly with me, and focused breakout sessions. Through Wednesday, Daniel and the other West Coast managers would arrive Sunday afternoon. He believed he would finally be meeting the mysterious CEO he needed to impress. The person who had, according to what he'd been told, specifically approved his innovative approaches to the Seattle property. The irony was almost painful. For 8 years, I had supported Daniel's career from the shadows, offering insights disguised as innocent questions, making connections that he believed had happened through his own networking prowess, even ensuring that Harrington Hotels became aware of his exceptional talent when he was ready to leave his previous position. All along, he had attributed his rapid career advancement to his own brilliance, never once questioning why certain opportunities seemed to fall into his lap at precisely the right moment. His mother had been even more convinced of his exceptional destiny, seeing each step up the ladder as confirmation of the Chen family's innate superiority in the hospitality industry, a narrative she had constructed wholesale from the modest foundation of her father-in-law's long-closed restaurant. The Belltown apartment welcomed me with the clean lines and uncompromised aesthetic I preferred. Modern furnishings in rich blues and grays, walls adorned with local artists' works, floor-to-ceiling windows framing views of Puget Sound. I kicked off my heels and moved through the space with the freedom of being utterly myself, without monitoring my expressions or moderating my movements to accommodate Daniel's preferences. In the spare bedroom that served as my home office, I opened my laptop and sent a brief message to the executive team. Seattle report review complete. Additional focus needed on staff retention and infrastructure priorities. We'll discuss at Monday's post-introduction session. Then, because I couldn't resist, I checked Daniel's calendar, visible to me as CEO through our company systems. He had blocked off the entire evening for design team working dinner, with Melissa's name specifically, noted as attending. What wasn't logged was the hotel reservation that had appeared on our joint credit card earlier that day, a suite at the Olympic, a competitor's property where he was less likely to be recognized by staff. The evidence of his betrayal should have hurt more than it did. Instead, I felt a curious detachment, as if observing the behavior of someone I was studying rather than a husband I had loved. Perhaps I had already begun separating from him emotionally long before his mother's orchestrated humiliation, recognizing on some level that what we shared was more performance than partnership. I poured myself a glass of the Cabernet I kept. Here, a vintage Daniel had once dismissed as overpriced when I'd suggested adding it to our home collection, and moved to the balcony. The night air carried the salt-tinged scent of the Sound, and distant ferry horns created a melancholy soundtrack for my thoughts. The woman I had been 8 years ago, when I first met Daniel at a hotel industry fundraiser, seemed like a stranger. Now, I had already founded Harrington Hotels, was already establishing myself in the business world under my own name while maintaining a separate social identity. I was 28. Still proving myself in a male-dominated industry where youth and gender were twin barriers to being taken seriously. Daniel had been charming that night, attentive in a way few men had been once they learned of my family's wealth and business connections. Most were either intimidated or saw me as a prize to be acquired. Daniel, rising through management at a competitor's hotel, had seemed different, genuinely interested in my thoughts, making me laugh with insider stories about demanding guests and hospitality disasters averted. When he'd asked what I did, I'd given him the simplified version I used at social functions. Family business consulting. It wasn't exactly a lie. My family had been in hospitality for generations, though on a much grander scale than I implied. My grandfather had built a small regional hotel chain that my father had expanded nationally before his death, leaving me both wealth and industry knowledge that most people my age couldn't imagine. Daniel had pursued me with the perfect blend of confidence and respect. The marriage had made sense at the time, a partner who understood the demands of the hospitality world, but didn't directly compete in my specific company, someone who could manage the social aspects of business connections while I built something substantial, something that was entirely mine, not my father's legacy, but my own creation. I'd never intended to keep Harrington Hotels a secret from him permanently. In those early days, I had imagined eventually bringing him into my confidence, perhaps even into the business once it was established enough to withstand his ego. But something had shifted during our first year of marriage. "You don't need to work, Liv," he'd said when I mentioned possibly taking a more visible role in hotel operations. "Focus on our home, our social connections. That's more valuable than whatever entry-level position you'd get in this market." I'd recognized it then, the first glimpse of his need to be the provider, the achiever, the center of our universe. So I'd smiled and agreed, all while continuing to build Harrington through early morning calls, encrypted emails, and charity lunch meetings with business associates. As my company grew, acquiring new properties and establishing its reputation for boutique luxury with impeccable service, so did Daniel's resentment toward what he perceived as my contentment with being just a wife. The more successful he became, the more he seemed to need me to be less ambitious, less independent, less myself. "You've become so predictable, Liv," he told me 3 months ago after a dinner party. "All you talk about is local artists and that literacy foundation. My colleagues' wives at least have interesting careers or social connections." The irony had been almost painful. That same day, I'd closed a $40 million acquisition that made headlines in the hospitality press, under the name Olivia. Harrington, of course. The fictional literacy foundation had been my cover for the board meeting I'd conducted that morning. I took another sip of wine, the full weight of these accumulated moments settling over me. It wasn't just Daniel's betrayal with Melissa or his mother's orchestrated humiliation. It was the gradual erosion of my authentic self in service of a marriage that worked precisely because I pretended to be someone I wasn't. My phone buzzed with a text from Tara. "Everything in motion for Sunday. Security team briefed. Legal standing by. You okay?" I typed back. "Never better. Add the staff satisfaction data to the Seattle Review. I want a complete picture before decisions are made." Tara responded immediately. "Already included. Get some rest, Liv. Next week will be intense." She wasn't wrong. The leadership retreat would be professionally challenging for everyone involved, but especially for Daniel, who would face not just the revelation of his wife's true identity, but a comprehensive review of his management decisions by the very person he had been deceiving, both professionally and personally. I leaned against the balcony railing, watching the lights of a container ship moving slowly across the darkened water. There was a strange peace in knowing that the careful compartmentalization of my life was coming to an end. Whatever happened, at the retreat, I would emerge from it as a single integrated person, no longer divided between Olivia Chen and Olivia Harrington, but simply myself. Daniel had benefited from our arrangement more than he knew. How many doors had opened for him because of connections I'd made? How many insights had he gleaned from casual comments I'd made based on information I shouldn't technically have had? He'd attributed his rapid career advancement to his own brilliance, never once questioning why certain opportunities seemed to fall into his lap at just the right moment. Until 6 months ago, when he'd hit a ceiling at his previous hotel. No further advancement forthcoming, no matter how many hours he put in. His frustration had turned to bitterness, then to wandering eyes. First professionally, as he began exploring positions at other hotels, then personally, as Melissa entered the picture. When the opportunity at the Seattle Harrington had suddenly appeared, he'd seen it as validation of his exceptional talents. He had no idea I'd created the position specifically for him after hearing from mutual friends that his career had stalled. Not out of charity, but curiosity. I wanted to see his unfiltered professional capabilities without the advantages my connections had unknowingly provided. I hadn't anticipated Melissa or Eleanor's machinations, but their appearance had simply accelerated a process already in motion. The separation between my professional and personal lives had been unsustainable for years. Something would have eventually forced integration. I just hadn't expected it to be my mother-in-law's attempt to orchestrate my replacement. I finished my wine and moved back inside, setting the glass in the sink and preparing for bed with mechanical precision. Tomorrow would require perfect focus and energy. Tonight's continued deception was necessary, but soon, very soon, I would step fully into the power I had built over the past decade. And in 7 days, Daniel and Eleanor would discover exactly who they had tried to diminish so carelessly. Sometimes an ending is just the beginning you never saw coming. Dawn arrived with the particular clarity that follows a night of life-altering decisions. I woke before my alarm, the pale light of early morning filtering through the blinds of my Belltown apartment. For the first time in years, I had slept deeply, uninterrupted by the usual tension of maintaining separate lives. I moved through my morning routine with practiced efficiency. Shower, hair, makeup applied with the precision of armor. Today I selected a sapphire blue Armani suit I'd never worn at home, part of my Olivia Harrington wardrobe that normally hung in the closet of this apartment, never to be seen by Daniel or his mother. Standing before the full-length mirror, I barely recognized the reflection staring back at me. Not because of the suit, I wore similar attire daily at my actual office, but because of the expression on my face. Gone was the careful mask of supportive wife, the pleasant half-smile I'd perfected for Daniel's business functions. In its place was something harder, clearer, the face of a woman who had finally stopped pretending. "Who are you?" I whispered. To my reflection, genuinely curious. For so long, I'd compartmentalized my life, Olivia Chen at home, Olivia Harrington in the boardroom, that I'd sometimes lost track of where the performance ended and my authentic self began. Last night's humiliation had torn down that dividing wall. The careful separation I'd maintained between my personal and professional lives had served its purpose, but Eleanor's cruelty had shattered that arrangement. Now the woman in the mirror was neither purely Olivia Chen nor Olivia Harrington, but something new emerging from both, integrated, undivided, and dangerously clear-eyed. I made coffee in the apartment's sleek kitchen, noticing a text message from Daniel. "Stayed at the hotel last night. Design meeting ran late. Meeting contractors this morning. See you at home tonight." No mention of our anniversary dinner. No acknowledgement of his mother's behavior. No recognition that anything significant had occurred. Just the casual certainty that I would be waiting at home, accepting whatever scraps of explanation he offered. I didn't bother responding. Another notification appeared, a social media alert. Melissa had posted a photo from last night. Not from our anniversary dinner, thankfully, but from what was clearly the working dinner afterward. She and Daniel sat close together at a restaurant table, heads bent over what appeared to be design documents, champagne glasses at their elbows. The caption read, "Late nights and great insights with the visionary behind Seattle's most exciting hotel renovation. Some people just understand the industry at a different level. Hospitality excellence. Mentor moments." I stared at the image, noting the calculated angle that showcased both her professional focus and the unmistakable intimacy between them. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was already playing the role of ambitious man's supportive partner, positioning herself as both protégé and asset to his career. A role I had played myself, though with dramatically different motives and endgame. The photo ignited something deeper than anger, a profound weariness with the entire charade. How exhausting it had been, maintaining the fiction of the devoted corporate wife while building something significant in the shadows. How many dinner parties had I hosted? How many conversations had I carefully modulated? How many of my own accomplishments had I downplayed to protect Daniel's fragile ego? I closed the social media app and opened my secure email instead. 3 messages from my executive team awaited response, along with a confidential brief on Daniel's professional history compiled by our HR department when he'd applied for the general manager position. I had reviewed it before approving his hire, but now I studied it with fresh eyes, seeing the careful embellishments, the strategic omissions, the polished narrative of success that didn't quite align with his actual accomplishments. Daniel was good at what he did. I wouldn't have created a position for him otherwise, but not nearly as exceptional as he believed himself to be. His true talent lay in self-promotion, in creating the impression of indispensability while carefully managing upward. It had worked throughout his career, and he'd assumed it would work at Harrington as well. What he couldn't have known was that I had been watching his playbook for years, recognizing each move for exactly what it was. The careful cultivation of allies just senior enough to be useful, the strategic undermining of potential rivals through seemingly casual comments, the taking of credit for collaborative successes while distancing himself from failures. I had never called him out on these tactics, partly because they weren't directed at me, and partly because observing them had made me a better executive. Daniel had been my unwitting masterclass in corporate politics, teaching me to recognize manipulation in my own organization and guard against it. Now, sipping coffee in the kitchen that had been my private sanctuary, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what I had known subconsciously for years. Our marriage had been a transaction from the beginning. Daniel had wanted a wife who enhanced his professional image, attractive, socially adept, from a good family. I had wanted the cover of convention, a socially acceptable explanation for my frequent absences and early mornings as I built my company. For years, it had been a mutually beneficial arrangement. Only when Daniel began to see me as a limitation rather than an asset had the balance shifted. His growing resentment of what he perceived as my lack of ambition, the very fiction I had, maintained to protect his ego, had been the first sign that our unspoken contract was fraying. Last night had been Eleanor's notice of termination, delivered with calculated cruelty meant to establish her dominance in our new dynamic. She expected me to retreat, wounded and diminished, perhaps begging for reconciliation or at least a dignified exit. The public humiliation had been designed to establish the narrative from the beginning. Ambitious son moves on from his holding him back wife to upgrade to protégé who understands his drive. I set down my coffee cup and moved to the window, watching the morning light illuminate the city skyline. Seattle was coming awake, the early commuter traffic beginning to fill the streets below. How many aspects of my life with Daniel had been constructed as backdrop for his ambitions? And how willingly had I accommodated them while pursuing my own hidden agenda? The realization brought no satisfaction, only a clarifying sadness. We had used each other, certainly, but I had never sought to harm him. Even now, preparing to reveal myself as his ultimate boss, my intention wasn't revenge, but simply the removal of a mask that no longer served any purpose. My phone rang. Tara, calling for our morning briefing before the executive team meeting. "Good morning, Olivia," she said, using my professional name. "Are you coming into the office today, or working from the apartment?" "The office," I replied, making a final decision. "It's time to consolidate operations, have security clear out. The apartment this afternoon. I'll be working from a single location going forward." The apartment, maintained under the name Olivia Harrington, had been my refuge for years. The place where I transformed from Daniel's wife into the CEO. Its necessity had ended last night. "Understood," Tara replied, her tone professional but concerned. "And Daniel? How are you handling that situation?" I considered the question, weighing my personal hurt against my professional responsibilities. "Exactly according to corporate policy," I said finally. "He'll be evaluated on his performance alone, starting today. No special treatment, positive or negative. And the leadership retreat next week proceeds as planned. I'll reveal my identity at the beginning of the first session. Make sure Harold is prepared to manage the fallout." After ending the call, I gathered my things: laptop, portfolio, the small overnight bag I kept packed for unexpected business trips. As I prepared to leave the apartment, I paused at the entryway table where a silver-framed photo stood: Daniel. And me on our wedding day, my smile radiant and genuine. I had believed then that our marriage could eventually bridge the divide between my personal and professional lives, that the man I had chosen would be strong enough to celebrate my success, rather than feel diminished by it. I had been wrong. I placed the photo face down and walked out the door, locking it behind me. The woman who had left the Chen house yesterday evening, the perfect corporate wife with her anniversary gift and carefully applied makeup, would not be returning. In her place stood someone new, someone who had finally stopped compartmentalizing. Her power. I slid into the driver's seat of my car. Not the sensible luxury sedan Daniel believed I drove, but the high-performance vehicle I actually preferred. The weight of maintaining dual identities had been heavier than I'd realized. Now, as I navigated the morning traffic toward Harrington's headquarters, I felt lighter, sharper, more fully myself than I had in years. Daniel had orchestrated last night as my ending. He had no idea it was actually his beginning, the start, of discovering exactly who he had been married to all these years and what she was capable of. The glass and steel tower of Harrington Hotel's corporate headquarters gleamed in the morning sun as I pulled into my reserved parking space, the one marked CEO that had always been kept empty during my frequent travels. Today, it would be filled. Today, Olivia Harrington would step fully into the light. The executive floor was already bustling when I arrived. Priya approached with a tablet as I stepped off the elevator. "The regional manager's quarterly reports are in," she said, falling into step beside me. "And the final preparations for the leadership retreat have been confirmed. The Cascade Lodge staff are ready for Sunday's arrivals. Any special requests from our Seattle manager?" I asked, unable to resist. Priya's lips twitched slightly. "Mr. Chen requested the premium corner suite with the mountain view. He also added a guest to his reservation yesterday, a Ms. Parker. The reservation simply lists her as hospitality consultant." "Approve the suite, but have her assigned to a separate room on a different floor," I said. "Site company policy about accommodations for consultants." "Already done," Priya assured me. "Also, the suggested seating chart for the opening session has been prepared for your approval." I reviewed the diagram on her tablet, a U-shaped configuration, with me at the head and Daniel positioned at the far end, ensuring maximum visual impact when I made my introduction. It was theatrical, perhaps, but necessary for the clean public break with pretense. "Perfect," I approved. "And the Seattle performance review?" "Compiled and ready for presentation after your introduction. The consensus findings are concerning." I wasn't surprised. "Quantifiable concerns or subjective impressions?" "Both," Priya admitted. "Staff turnover is 22% higher than our other properties. Maintenance requests are being deferred at an unsustainable rate. And the renovation plans prioritize cosmetic updates that have minimal impact on guest experience while ignoring structural issues that will be costly to address if delayed further." It was exactly as I had suspected. Daniel focusing on appearance over substance, quick wins over long-term stability. The approach had characterized his entire career: create immediate positive impressions, take credit, and move on before the deferred problems became apparent. "Prepare a complete analysis," I instructed. "I want options for corrective action ready for discussion." The morning unfolded with a series of meetings and decisions, each one moving me closer to the integrated identity I was embracing. By lunchtime, I had spoken with our major investors, reviewed the quarterly projections for all 32 properties, and approved the final details for the leadership retreat. Harold joined me for lunch in my private office, bringing deli sandwiches and his characteristic straight talk. "You seem different today," he observed, unwrapping his pastrami on rye. "Lighter somehow." "I'm no longer carrying the weight of a double life," I said, realizing the truth of it as I spoke. Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly monitor every word, every reaction, every piece of information to ensure it aligns with a fictional identity? Harold nodded, his eyes kind beneath bushy brows. I've always wondered why you maintained the separation for so long. The industry bias against young female executives was real when you started, certainly, but you proved yourself years ago. Why keep up the charade, especially in your marriage? It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly over the years. It started as practical necessity, I explained. The dual identity helped bypass certain barriers. But over time, it became a habit, and then a protection. Protection from what? Harold asked gently. From having to confront the reality that I'd married a man who needed me to be less than I am, I admitted. From acknowledging that our entire relationship was built on a foundation of carefully managed perceptions rather than genuine connection. Harold took a thoughtful bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly as he considered my words. And now? What happens after the retreat, after the revelation? I had been so focused on the moment of truth itself that I'd given little thought to what would follow. Professionally, we evaluate Daniel's performance objectively and make decisions accordingly, I said. Personally, I suppose that depends on how he responds to discovering his wife owns the company he works for. And how do you think he'll respond? I considered the question, drawing on 8 years of observing Daniel's reactions to challenges, to his self-image. Initially with shock, then denial, then an attempt to reframe the situation to his advantage, I predicted. He'll try to position himself as the injured party, the husband deceived by his manipulative wife. Once he realizes that narrative won't serve him professionally, he'll attempt to leverage our relationship to advance his position at Harrington. And when that fails? Harold asked. He'll leave, I said simply. Daniel has never stayed to fight battles he doesn't believe he can win. He'll resign, create a face-saving explanation, and find a position elsewhere where he can control the narrative about what happened. Harold's eyebrows rose. You've given this considerable thought. I've had 8 years to observe his patterns, I replied. Daniel is consistent if nothing else. As Harold gathered the lunch debris, his expression grew serious. I've watched you build this company through recessions, natural disasters, and a global pandemic. You've made hard decisions without flinching. But this, revealing yourself to a husband who has no idea who you really are, this is uncharted territory. Are you prepared for the personal fallout? The question deserved honest examination. I'm not sure anyone can be fully prepared for something like this, I admitted, but I'm certain the cost of continuing the deception would be greater than the pain of ending it. After Harold left, I found myself standing at the window of my office, watching seaplanes land on Lake Union in the distance. From this height, the city appeared orderly, each component functioning as part of a coherent whole. My life, I realized, was finally moving toward that same integration, separate pieces merging into an authentic identity. My phone chimed with a text from Daniel. Having dinner with potential investors tonight. Don't wait up. The casual dismissal, the unquestioned assumption that I would simply accept whatever explanation he offered, made me wonder how I had tolerated such treatment. For years, I didn't bother responding. Instead, I sent a message to Tara. Dinner at Altura tonight? 7 p.m.? We should discuss retreat contingencies. Her response came immediately. Already reserved a table. Lisa and Harold will join if that works. Perfect, I replied, grateful for friends who understood the significance of what was unfolding, colleagues who had known both versions of me and had patiently waited for integration. The afternoon brought a series of executive reviews, each focused on a different aspect of Harrington's operations. I participated fully, no longer mentally dividing my attention between my CEO responsibilities and maintaining my cover story. The freedom to engage completely without reservation or calculated moderation, was exhilarating. At 4 o'clock, Priya brought in the final preparations for the leadership retreat. Welcome packages for each property manager, schedules, presentation materials, and name badges. Daniel's badge sat on top of the stack, the irony of his printed name making me pause. Daniel Chen, General Manager, Seattle Harrington. Soon to be paired with a startling revelation about exactly who owned the hotel he managed. The transportation arrangements are confirmed, Priya said. We have vehicles scheduled to bring everyone from the airport to Cascade Lodge on Sunday. Mr. Chen indicated he'll be driving himself. Of course he would. Daniel always preferred to maintain control of his arrivals and departures, ensuring he could make appropriately timed entrances and strategic exits if necessary. And his guest? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Ms. Parker has requested a company car from the hotel, Priya confirmed. She's scheduled to arrive Sunday afternoon shortly before the welcome reception. I nodded, visualizing how the scenario would unfold. Daniel arriving at the mountain retreat with his protégé-turned-lover, both prepared to impress the Harrington executive team, completely unaware of the revelation awaiting them. One more thing, Priya added hesitantly. Ms. Chen, Eleanor, called the office this morning asking to speak with you. When informed you weren't available, she insisted on leaving a message. My eyebrows rose in surprise. What did she want? She said, and I quote, "Tell Olivia that I expect her at Sunday brunch to discuss certain family matters before they become unnecessarily complicated." I couldn't help but laugh at the presumption. I imagine she'll find things quite complicated enough after Monday morning's session. As the workday drew to a close, I found myself facing a decision I hadn't anticipated. Where to spend the night? The Belltown apartment was being cleared. Out. The house I shared with Daniel felt like returning to a performance I was no longer willing to give. A hotel seemed the obvious choice, but the irony of the CEO of Harrington Hotels checking into one of her own properties while her husband was presumably with another woman elsewhere felt a step too far toward melodrama. In the end, I chose simplicity. Priya, please have the guest suite on the executive floor prepared. I'll be staying here tonight. The private suite, maintained for visiting executives and investors who needed to work late, offered the perfect neutral ground. Neither the home I shared with Daniel, nor the apartment that represented my separate identity, but a space that acknowledged both aspects of my life while belonging fully to neither. By 7 o'clock, I was seated at Altura with Tara, Harold, and Lisa Nakamura, our VP of Operations. The intimate restaurant, with its focus on Pacific Northwest ingredients and Italian techniques, had always been a favorite of mine, though I had never been able to bring Daniel here without an elaborate explanation of how I knew about such an exclusive spot. To integration, Harold proposed, raising his glass in a toast once our wine had been poured. To finally meeting the whole Olivia, Lisa added with a warm smile. Tara simply clinked her glass against mine, her eyes communicating what words couldn't. Relief that I was finally stepping into my complete self, concern for the emotional journey ahead, and unwavering support regardless of the outcome. The conversation flowed easily, touching on business matters, but focusing more on the personal transformation I was experiencing. These three people had known both versions of me for years, had protected my privacy while gently questioning the necessity of maintaining the division. I've always wondered, Lisa said as our main courses arrived, how did you manage the practical aspects? The finances, the separate wardrobes, the explanations for your absences? Very carefully, I admitted. Separate bank accounts, a corporate apartment, an elaborate calendar of fictional charity events, and a husband who never looked too closely at anything that didn't directly center him. Did you ever come close to telling him? Tara asked. In the beginning, perhaps? I considered the question, wanting to be honest with myself as much as with my friends. I thought about it many times, especially in the first year, I said. There were moments when I almost did. when he'd express frustration about a work challenge that I could have easily solved, or when he'd dismissively reference female executives without realizing he was married to one. "What stopped you?" Harold asked gently. "Fear, initially," I acknowledged. Fear that he wouldn't see me the same way, that knowing my success would change the dynamic between us. Then, as I observed how he treated successful women in his professional circle, the subtle undermining, the slightly dismissive tone, I realized my fear was justified. "And yet you stayed," Lisa observed without judgment. "It was comfortable," I admitted, "emotionally unchallenging. Our arrangement allowed me to focus entirely on building Harrington without navigating the complications of a husband who felt threatened by my success. It was efficient, but lonely," Tara said softly. I met her gaze, acknowledging the truth of it. "Yes, increasingly so." "And now?" Harold asked. "What are you hoping will happen after the retreat?" It was the question I had been avoiding, focusing on the mechanics of the revelation rather than its aftermath. "Professionally, I want the Seattle property to have the leadership it deserves, whether that's Daniel or someone else," I said carefully. "Personally, I want to live without division. Beyond that, I haven't allowed myself to envision specific outcomes." Lisa's expression was thoughtful. "Do you think there's any possibility that Daniel, once he knows the truth, might actually rise to the occasion? That he might be capable of accepting your success and building something authentic with you?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on preparing for Daniel's likely negative reactions that I hadn't considered the remote possibility of a positive one. "I don't know," I admitted. 8 years of observing his patterns suggests otherwise, but people can surprise you. I'd like to believe he's capable of more growth than I've given him credit for." As we finished our meal and prepared to part ways, Harold placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Whatever happens next week, remember that you've already won the most important battle," he said. "You've chosen authenticity over accommodation, truth over comfortable fiction. That's a victory that can't be taken from you, regardless of how Daniel responds." His words stayed with me as I returned to Harrington headquarters and settled into the executive suite for the night. The space was impersonal but comfortable, designed to meet every practical need without imposing any particular personality. The corporate equivalent of a blank canvas. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with another text from Daniel. "Meetings. Running late. Staying at the hotel tonight to prepare for early contractor meeting. See you tomorrow evening. No inquiry about my whereabouts. No concern about how I might be feeling after his mother's behavior at our anniversary dinner. Just the assumption that I would be waiting at home, accepting whatever narrative he provided." I set the phone aside without responding and moved to the window, gazing out at the Seattle skyline illuminated against the night sky. In just over 72 hours, I would stand before the assembled property managers of Harrington Hotels and introduce myself as their CEO. Daniel would finally see me, truly see me, for the first time in our 8-year marriage. The thought brought neither satisfaction nor anxiety, but a profound sense of rightness. Whatever came next would be built on truth rather than performance, reality rather than carefully managed perceptions. I was ready. Cascade Lodge stood nestled among towering pines, its log and stone architecture blending harmoniously with the mountain landscape. The sprawling retreat center had been a cornerstone of Harrington Hotel's corporate culture since I acquired it 5 years ago, a place where strategy met serenity, where the leadership team could step away from daily operations to focus on long-term vision. I arrived Saturday afternoon, a full day before the other attendees were scheduled to begin arriving. I wanted time to settle in, to walk the familiar grounds and prepare mentally for the revelation that would forever alter both my marriage and my company's dynamics. The lodge manager, Joanna, greeted me personally at the main entrance. "Ms. Harrington, welcome back. Everything has been prepared according to your specifications. Thank you, Joanna. Have there been any changes to the guest list? Just one. Mr. Chen from the Seattle property called this morning to confirm that his consultant will be joining for all sessions, not just the social events. I explained that our policy restricts strategy sessions to Harrington employees only, but he was quite insistent. I smiled slightly at Daniel's predictable behavior. Let's accommodate the request for now. Ms. Parker may attend the opening session. After that, we'll reassess based on changing circumstances. Joanna nodded, her professional demeanor masking any curiosity about my cryptic response. Your usual cabin has been prepared. The executive team is scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning, with property managers coming in throughout the afternoon. And Mr. Chen's arrival time? He indicated he'd be here around 4 o'clock. I've assigned him the Cedar Suite in the North Wing as requested. And Ms. Parker? Juniper Room in the East Wing, as per your instructions. I made sure it's our nicest standard accommodation, but distinctly separate from the premium suites. Perfect. Thank you, Joanna. As she handed me the key to my private cabin, she hesitated. If you don't mind my saying so, Ms. Harrington, there's something different about you this visit. You seem lighter somehow. Her observation echoed Harold's from days earlier. Was the liberation of impending truth so visible on my face? I feel lighter, I admitted. Sometimes setting down a burden you've carried too long feels like growing wings. I spent the afternoon reviewing my presentation for the opening session one final time. The material was straightforward. Quarterly results, strategic priorities, market positioning, standard CEO communication executed with precision and clarity. What made this presentation unique was not its content, but its context. The revelation of my identity to a man who believed he had left me at home, waiting for his return. As I sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sun begin its descent behind the mountains, I found myself questioning my motivations with renewed intensity. Was this carefully orchestrated revelation truly about professional necessity, or was it driven by personal vindication? Had I structured this entire scenario simply to see the look on Daniel's face when he realized the truth? The question deserved honest examination. I had told myself and others that this approach was strategically sound, allowing Daniel to demonstrate his unfiltered professional capabilities before the complication of our personal history emerged. But there were other approaches I could have taken. A private disclosure before the retreat, for instance, or a delayed revelation after he had settled into the role. Instead, I had chosen this path. A public unveiling in front of the entire executive leadership. The decision carried undeniable theatrical elements that served no purely business purpose. The realization didn't shame me, but it did clarify something important. This moment of revelation wasn't just about Daniel discovering who I was. It was about me fully claiming who I had become after years of compartmentalizing my life to accommodate his ego. I was choosing to stand wholly in my power without apology or dilution. Yes, there would be satisfaction in watching Daniel confront the reality he had so carelessly dismissed, but the deeper victory wasn't in his reaction. It was in my integration. My refusal to continue diminishing myself to make others comfortable. With that clarity, I closed my presentation materials and prepared for the evening, sleeping more soundly than I had since the night of the anniversary dinner. The executive team began arriving shortly after breakfast the next morning, each member stopping by my cabin to check in before settling into their own accommodations. By mid-afternoon, the property was alive with activity. Senior leaders gathering in small groups on the main lodge porch, staff preparing the conference room for the opening session, caterers arranging the welcome dinner. I remained in my cabin, reviewing the final attendance list Priya had sent over. Daniel's name appeared under Property Managers, his arrival confirmed for 4 p.m. A handwritten note in the margin indicated he would be accompanied by Melissa Parker, listed as consultant for the welcome dinner and opening session, at precisely 3:45 p.m. I made my way to the conference center, choosing a path that avoided the main lodge where arrivals were gathering for pre-dinner networking. Tara met me at the side entrance, her expression a mixture of professional composure and barely concealed anticipation. "Everyone's in position," she reported. "Daniel arrived with Ms. Parker approximately 20 minutes ago. They're currently on the main deck where he's introducing her to the regional directors." "And the seating arrangement?" "As planned. You'll enter from the left after Harold's introduction, seated at the head of the U with Daniel positioned at the far right, giving you a clear line of sight across the table." I nodded, making a final adjustment to my suit jacket. "Has he asked about Olivia Harrington?" Tara's lips quirked slightly. "Repeatedly. He's been working the room, trying to determine who you are and whether you've arrived yet. Several people have indicated you're around somewhere, but keeping a low profile before the formal introduction." The predictability of Daniel's behavior was almost comforting, networking aggressively, gathering intelligence, positioning himself advantageously before an important meeting. These were the tactics that had served him well throughout his career, the careful preparations that allowed him to present the polished, confident persona he had cultivated. Today, those preparations would be rendered useless by a single revelation. "It's time," Tara said, checking her watch. "Harold is beginning. The welcome now." We moved through the corridor to the conference room's side entrance, pausing just outside the door. Through the small window, I could see Harold standing at the head of the U-shaped table arrangement, welcoming the assembled Harrington team to the retreat. The room was filled with 30 of our company's leaders, from executive team members to property managers from across the country. Daniel sat near the far end of the right table leg, his posture conveying casual confidence. Melissa was seated beside him, professionally attired but visibly nervous in the company of so many senior Harrington executives. Even from this distance, I could read Daniel's expression. Alert, engaged, but with that hint of calculation I knew so well, mentally mapping the power dynamics in the room. Harold's voice carried clearly through the door. "I'm extremely pleased to formally introduce our CEO and founder, who has returned from an extended period overseeing our international expansion to take a more active role in our domestic operations." I took a deep breath, centering myself in the moment. This wasn't about Daniel, I reminded myself. This was about stepping fully into the life I had built, claiming the achievement that had always been mine. "Please join me in welcoming Olivia Harrington," Harold concluded, turning toward the door. Tara opened it, and I walked into the conference room with measured steps. The assembled executives, most of whom had worked with me for years, rose in a wave of practiced professional courtesy. I moved to the head of the table, accepting Harold's handshake and taking the position he vacated. My eyes found Daniel. Immediately, watching as confusion gave way to disbelief on his face. He had half risen with the others, his movement arrested mid-stand as recognition dawned. For 3 breathtaking seconds, his carefully constructed professional mask dissolved, completely, revealing raw, unfiltered shock. "Thank you, Harold," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily across the silent room. "And thank you all for being here today. For those I haven't yet had the pleasure of working with directly, I'm Olivia Harrington, founder and CEO of Harrington Hotels." I paused, allowing my gaze to move deliberately around the table, including each person in the room before finally returning to Daniel, who had managed to complete his rise to standing, though his knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table. "Some of you may know me by another name," I continued evenly. "In my personal life, I'm Olivia Chen." The ripple of reaction through the room was subtle but unmistakable. Those who hadn't known exchanging glances of surprise, those who had, watching Daniel with barely concealed interest. To his credit, he maintained his composure, though the color had drained from his face entirely. For the past 8 years, I've maintained separate professional and personal identities for a variety of reasons, some strategic, some cultural, some simply practical. That separation ends today. I opened my portfolio, signaling a shift to business. Now let's discuss Harrington's position and our strategies for the coming quarter. The meeting proceeded with professional efficiency. Each executive presented their department updates while I facilitated discussion and provided strategic direction. Throughout the presentation, Daniel remained silent, his earlier networking confidence replaced by a stillness that bordered on rigidity. I neither avoided him nor singled him out, treating him exactly as I did every other property manager in the room, with professional courtesy and appropriate attention to his role. When the Seattle property appeared on the agenda, I acknowledged his team's contributions to the renovation, planning without specific reference to our previous interactions. Only once did our eyes meet directly, during Tara's presentation on organizational structure, when a slide displayed the reporting lines with Daniel's position clearly subordinate to both the regional director and ultimately me. In that moment of eye contact, I saw something shift in his expression, the shock giving way to calculation as he began processing the full implications of his new reality. As the meeting concluded and executives began gathering their materials for the short break before dinner, I made a final announcement. Thank you all for your attention today. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss property-specific initiatives in greater detail. Department directors, please ensure your teams have prepared their implementation timelines as previously requested. The room emptied gradually. Executives, stopping to exchange brief words with me before heading to the dining hall for dinner. Daniel remained seated, his eyes fixed on the table before him, clearly wrestling with his next move. Beside him, Melissa looked shell-shocked, her gaze darting between Daniel and me as the implications of the revelation sank in. When only the three of us remained, Daniel finally looked up, his expression carefully composed into something approaching professional neutrality. "I think," he said quietly, "we should talk." I closed my portfolio and considered him across the length of the conference table. The man who had allowed his mother to publicly humiliate me just days earlier, now reconsidering his position in light of new information. "Yes," I agreed. My tone measured. "I believe we should." I turned to Melissa, who looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. "Ms. Parker, would you excuse us, please? I'm sure you understand the need for a private conversation." She rose quickly, gathering her things with nervous efficiency. "Of course, Ms." She hesitated, uncertain which name to use. "Harrington is fine in professional settings," I supplied evenly. She nodded and hurried from the room, casting one last bewildered glance at Daniel before the door closed behind her. The conference room emptied, leaving Daniel and me alone in a silence, heavy with unspoken recriminations. Through the large windows, I could see executives gathering on the lodge's expansive deck, their curious glances occasionally drifting toward the conference room before quickly averting when they realized they might be observed. Daniel remained, seated at the far end of the table, his initial shock now giving way to the careful calculation I recognized from countless negotiations. I made no move to approach him, instead organizing my presentation materials with unhurried precision. Let him come to me, I decided. Let him traverse the physical distance he had created between us. After what seemed like minutes but was likely only seconds, he stood and walked toward me, each step measured as if approaching an unexploded device. He chose a chair 3 seats away, close enough for private conversation, but maintaining a buffer that spoke volumes about his uncertainty. "You're Olivia Harrington," he said finally, his voice flat with disbelief, despite having had nearly an hour to process this reality. "I am," I confirmed simply. "For how long?" The question came quickly, an edge of accusation beneath the words. I leaned back slightly, studying him. "I founded Harrington Hotels 10 years ago, shortly before we met." His eyes narrowed, processing the implications with the rapid calculation that had always made him effective in crisis scenarios. "The entire time we were married, you were running a major hotel chain without telling me." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes. Why? The single word carried layers of incredulity. Why the secrecy? Why the separate identity? Why the elaborate deception? I considered the question carefully, wanting to be precise in my response. Initially, it was a pragmatic business decision. A young woman trying to establish herself in the hospitality industry faces certain obstacles. Using a slightly different name and being deliberately vague about my personal life helped bypass some of those barriers. And later, he pressed, after we were married? After you'd established yourself? I met his gaze directly. Later, it became clear that our marriage functioned best when you believed your career was the primary focus of our household. The truth of this statement hit its mark with devastating accuracy. Daniel flinched slightly, then quickly masked the reaction with a scoff. So, this was all some elaborate test? Setting me up to fail? No, Daniel, I replied calmly. This was me building something substantial while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that seemed necessary for our marriage to function. You never asked about my charity work or women's business meetings. You never questioned why I needed a dedicated home office with enterprise-grade security. You simply assumed I was occupied with activities that posed no threat to your self-image. Daniel leaned back, his expression hardening. And my position here? Was that part of your plan all along? Hiring your husband without disclosing your relationship? You were hired because your qualifications matched what the Seattle property needed, I replied evenly. The position was created based on legitimate business requirements. The position was created based on legitimate business requirements. Your application was evaluated by HR and the regional team before reaching my desk. I simply approved their recommendation. How generous of you, he said, sarcasm edging his tone. And were you planning to disclose your identity before or after your mother publicly humiliated me? This leadership retreat was scheduled months ago, I corrected him firmly. Long before you ever interviewed for the position. Your mother's behavior at our anniversary dinner changed nothing about this timeline. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing, alongside the conference table. The controlled movement was familiar, his way of managing frustration when a negotiation wasn't proceeding as anticipated. I remained seated, watching his process unfold exactly as it always did. Initial disbelief, searching for leverage, recalculating his position. You've made me look like a fool, he said finally, turning to face me. In front of the entire executive team. No, Daniel, I said quietly. Your mother did that when she orchestrated my public replacement at our anniversary dinner. I've simply revealed who I actually am. The reference to that night hit him like a physical blow, cutting through his professional indignation to the personal betrayal beneath. For a moment, genuine emotion broke through his careful facade. A flash of shame quickly suppressed. That was personal, he said dismissively. This is business. Is it? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, you've made our personal situation very much a business matter. Melissa is waiting for you right now, isn't she? Ready to play the, supportive partner role at the welcome dinner? His jaw tightened. Melissa has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this, I countered. You positioned her as my replacement, Daniel, as someone who understands the hospitality industry in ways I supposedly don't. You allowed your mother to introduce her at our anniversary dinner while you sat silently by. You made claims about me, about my capabilities and aspirations, that were fundamentally false, and you did so publicly, with deliberate cruelty. I didn't know, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. How could I possibly have known who you really were? That's exactly the point, I said, my calm unbroken. You never asked. In 8 years of marriage, you never once looked beyond the carefully curated image you had of me, the supportive wife who existed to advance your ambitions. Even when evidence contradicted that image, you dismissed it rather than questioning your assumptions. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I had seen countless times during our marriage. "So what now?" he demanded. "You're my boss. I'm your subordinate, and we're getting divorced. Is this your idea of professional, of appropriate corporate governance?" The attempt to shift from personal accountability to corporate ethics was predictable, moving the battlefield to terrain where he felt more confident. "Your position reports to the regional director and ultimately to Tara as COO," I stated factually. "While I understand the unusual nature of this situation, there is no direct reporting relationship between us. The board has been fully briefed on the circumstances and approved temporary governance adjustments to manage any potential conflicts." "You've thought of everything," he said bitterly. "That's literally my job," I replied simply. "Just as it's been for the past decade, while you believed I was planning dinner parties and attending charity auctions." Daniel paced to the window, staring out at the assembled executives on the deck. From his vantage point, he could undoubtedly see Melissa among them, attempting to network while processing the sudden, dramatic shift in her strategic position. "She's going to leave me," he said suddenly, the words seemingly emerging without his permission. The unexpected vulnerability of the statement caught me off guard. Not once in our 8 years of marriage had Daniel admitted the fear of abandonment that drove so many of his actions. "Melissa?" I asked, though I knew exactly who he meant. He nodded without turning from the window. She wanted the ambitious executive on the rise. The man who could discard his holding him back wife and upgrade to a partner who matched his trajectory. Now I'm the idiot who didn't know his wife owned his company. The punchline to a corporate joke. For a fleeting moment, I felt an echo of the empathy that had once bound us together, the recognition of his fundamental insecurity beneath the confident exterior. Then I remembered the calculated cruelty of his silent complicity in my public dismissal, and my momentary compassion hardened into something more resolute. "Your relationship with Melissa is not my concern," I said. "But I would note that if she leaves because your professional standing has been compromised, she's proving my point rather than yours. A partner who values your status over your character was never an upgrade in any meaningful sense." He turned from the window, his expression tightening back into professional neutrality. "What exactly do you want from me, Olivia? Or should I call you Ms. Harrington now?" "What I want is irrelevant to your professional responsibilities," I replied. "You were hired to lead the Seattle property because your skills are valuable to Harrington. That assessment hasn't changed because of our personal situation. So I should just what? Pretend this morning never happened? Go back to work as if my wife isn't secretly the CEO who approved my hiring?" "Not secretly," I corrected. "Not anymore. And what you do next is entirely your decision. You can resign if you find the situation untenable. You can request to transfer to one of our regional offices if you prefer more distance, or you can demonstrate the professional capabilities that earned you this position in the first place." Daniel studied me with the careful attention he typically reserved for complex negotiations, searching for hidden motivations behind my measured words. "You want me to stay?" he said finally, realization dawning. "This isn't about humiliating me. You actually want me to continue in this role." I allowed a small, precise smile. "What I want is for Harrington to retain valuable talent, regardless of personal complications. Your performance over the past 6 months, while you believed you were impressing an unknown CEO, demonstrated genuine capabilities. Those capabilities remain useful to this organization, even after what happened at our anniversary dinner." "Why?" The question contained a note of genuine puzzlement, as if he couldn't reconcile my professional assessment with his personal actions. "Business and personal are separate considerations," I said. "I've maintained that separation for years. The question is whether you can do the same." Daniel laughed without humor. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," I acknowledged. "But it is clear. Your professional value hasn't changed because of our personal circumstances. What has changed is your understanding of the actual power dynamics at play. Daniel moved back to the conference table, resting his hands on the polished wood as if seeking stability. All those years, he said quietly. All those nights I came home talking about my deals, my achievements, my career trajectory. You were running a company worth millions. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? The question hung between us, deceptively simple yet impossibly complex. I considered deflecting with practicalities about professional separation or strategic necessity, but the moment called for something more fundamental. Because you needed me to be less than you are, I said finally. Your confidence required my subordination. The moment I surpassed your achievements, which I already had when we met, you would have seen me as competition rather than partner. His instinct was to deny it. I could see the rejection forming on his lips. But something stopped him. Perhaps the realization that our current circumstances proved my point more eloquently than any argument could. I would have adjusted, he said instead, though his tone lacked conviction. Would you? I challenged gently. When I suggested taking a part-time consulting role in our first year of marriage, you immediately discouraged it. When my friend Lauren started her own business, you called her aggressively ambitious and questioned her priorities. Every woman in your professional circle who demonstrated significant achievement became someone to critique rather than admire. He had no response to this, perhaps recognizing the pattern for the first time himself. Your professional identity has always been built on being exceptional, I continued. The star performer, the indispensable talent, the one moving fastest up the ladder. My success threatened that narrative, so I kept it separate to preserve both my company and our marriage. And now? He asked, his voice subdued. What's the endgame here? Professionally, you do your job. I do mine. And Harrington benefits from both our talents. I spread my hands in a gesture of finality. Personally, that book is closed, Daniel. Your mother made that decision very publicly last week. His expression hardened. So this was revenge, making me look foolish in front of the entire executive team. No, I corrected firmly. This was scheduled months ago, before you ever interviewed for the position. Your timing with Melissa created this particular scenario, not mine. A knock at the conference room door interrupted whatever response he might have made. Tara entered with a deliberate lack of haste, her expression professionally neutral despite the obvious tension in the room. Excuse me, she said. The welcome dinner is beginning, and several executives have questions about tomorrow's sessions. Thank you, Tara, I replied, gathering my materials. I'll join them momentarily. Daniel straightened, adjusting his tie in an unconscious gesture of composure. And Miss Parker? She's still at the retreat as my guest. I considered this briefly. That's your decision. If you feel her presence is appropriate under the circumstances, she's welcome to stay. The subtle challenge in my words wasn't lost on him. Having Melissa remain would force him to navigate introduction of his upgrade to his newly revealed boss wife, a social complexity that would test even his considerable interpersonal skills. I think, he said carefully, it might be best if she returned to Seattle this evening. I nodded without comment, neither approving nor questioning his choice. As I moved toward the door, Daniel's voice stopped me. What was real? He asked, the question bare of pretense for perhaps the first time in our relationship. In our marriage, was any of it genuine? I turned back, finding unexpected honesty in his expression. For a moment, the calculated networker and status-seeking executive were gone, leaving only the man I had once believed I could build a life with. My hope was real, I said quietly. My belief that eventually we could be true partners, that you would become secure enough in your own achievements to celebrate mine. That hope faded gradually, replaced by the pragmatic recognition that our marriage worked precisely because you didn't know who I really was. He absorbed this with a slight nod, neither accepting nor rejecting the assessment. And now everyone knows. Yes, I agreed. Now everyone knows. As I left the conference room, I felt the weight of his gaze following me, not with anger or calculation now, but with something closer to genuine reckoning. For perhaps the first time, Daniel was seeing me clearly, without the distorting lens of his own needs and assumptions. Outside, the executive team waited on the lodge deck, conversations pausing briefly as I emerged among them. In the distance stood Melissa, her confident posture now uncertain, her networking smile faltering as she registered the gravity of conversations happening around her. Harold approached, offering a glass of sparkling water with a subtle nod of support. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. "Professional boundaries established," I replied, matching his discretion. "Personal consequences acknowledged." Harold's eyes moved past me to where Daniel now exited the conference room, his expression carefully composed into professional neutrality despite the seismic shift in his circumstances. "And Mr. Chen?" Harold asked. I watched as Daniel made his way directly to Melissa, bending to speak quietly in her ear. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, her eyes darting to me with sudden recognition. "Making difficult decisions," I observed, "about what kind of man he wants to be going forward." As the group moved toward the dining hall for dinner, I caught fragments of conversation around me. Speculation about what had transpired in the conference room, assessments of Daniel's future with the company, theories about our marriage and its dissolution. For once, I made no effort to manage these narratives. The truth, in all its complicated messiness, was finally sufficient. The game of perception that had defined our relationship for 8 years had ended. What remained was the straightforward reality that Daniel had been avoiding since the moment we met. I had always been more than he imagined, and his failure to see it had ultimately cost him everything he genuinely valued. The remainder of the retreat unfolded with professional efficiency, though an undercurrent of fascination rippled through every session. Executives who had known my dual identity for years maintained admirable composure, while those newly informed struggled to reconcile the revelation with their previous understanding of company hierarchy. Daniel remained for the morning sessions, his contributions carefully measured and strictly professional. If executives were watching for signs of personal distress or resentment, he provided none, demonstrating the compartmentalization skills that had served him well throughout his career. The only visible change in circumstances was Melissa's absence. She had departed shortly after dinner on the first night, a car arranged to take her back to Seattle with minimal disruption to the retreat schedule. By evening, as executives gathered, for the closing dinner in the lodge's grand dining room, I had settled into a new equilibrium. No longer maintaining the exhausting separation between personal and professional identities, simply existing as myself in all contexts. The relief of this integration was profound. Like setting down a heavy burden I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten its weight. I was reviewing the next day's departure schedule with Tara when I felt a familiar presence at my elbow. Daniel, dressed impeccably for dinner, his expression pleasant and professionally engaged. "Ms. Harrington," he said, his tone pitched to carry just far enough for those nearby to hear. "I was hoping we might discuss the renovation timeline for the Seattle property. I've had some thoughts about restructuring the phases to minimize guest disruption." The deliberate use of my professional name, the careful positioning of our interaction as purely business-focused, it was classic Daniel, reframing our dynamic on terms he found more favorable. "Of course, Mr. Chen," I replied, matching his professional tone. "Perhaps after dinner? The pathway around the lake is quite pleasant for evening conversations." His momentary surprise at my easy acceptance was quickly masked with a nod. "That would be perfect. Thank you." As he moved away to speak with another executive, Tara raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's wise?" "Necessary, not wise," I corrected. "Better to address whatever he's planning directly than allow it to fester." Dinner proceeded pleasantly, with the initial shock of the first day's revelation giving way to more routine business discussions. I purposely seated myself at a table with regional directors, away from both Daniel and the executive, team members who knew our history best. The conversation remained focused on business opportunities and strategic initiatives, precisely as it should at a leadership retreat. As coffee and dessert were served, I excused myself, indicating I needed to prepare for the following day's departure procedures. Daniel caught my eye across the room, a subtle nod confirming our planned conversation. 20 minutes later, I made my way to the lakeshore path, a well-lit trail that curved along the water's edge before looping back to the main lodge. Daniel was already waiting, standing at the trailhead with his hands in his pockets, gazing out over the darkened lake. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, creating a scene of deceptive tranquility. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as I approached, his tone softer than the professional cadence he'd used earlier. "You mentioned the Seattle timeline," I prompted, indicating we should walk. We fell into step along the path, maintaining a professional distance between us. For several moments, Daniel said nothing, seemingly gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice held none of the business focus he'd projected at dinner. "I spoke with my mother this afternoon," he said. "She's struggling to process the situation." I said nothing, waiting for him to reach his actual point. This wasn't about renovation timelines, and we both knew it. "She insists she was acting in my best interest," he continued, a note of weariness entering his voice. "That she could see what I couldn't, that you weren't committed to supporting my career. The irony being that I've supported your career more effectively than either of you realized," I observed. Daniel glanced at me sharply, then nodded in reluctant acknowledgement. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about me needing you to be less than you are. There might be some truth to that." The admission, partial as it was, surprised me. Daniel rarely acknowledged personal shortcomings, preferring to reframe narratives in ways that preserved his self-image. "But I also think," he added carefully, "that we have an opportunity here." "An opportunity?" I repeated, instantly alert to the shift in his approach. "Our personal relationship may be over, but professionally, we could be quite effective together." His tone warmed, shifting into the persuasive cadence he used for pitching investment concepts. "Your strategic vision combined with my implementation skills, we could accelerate Harrington's growth significantly." I remained silent, recognizing the familiar pattern unfolding. This was Daniel's standard recovery technique, acknowledging just enough fault to appear reflective while simultaneously positioning himself as an essential ally moving forward. "The Seattle renovation is just the beginning," he continued, enthusiasm entering his voice. "With your backing and my execution, we could target acquisitions that would transform Harrington's market position within 18 months. "And what exactly are you proposing?" I asked, my tone neutral. He stopped walking, turning to face me directly in the fading light. His expression held the earnest intensity that had once made him so compelling in negotiations. "A professional partnership," he said. "You as the strategic visionary, me as your implementation specialist. We expand my role to work directly with you on high-priority initiatives, bypassing some of the more cumbersome approval processes." And there it was, the actual proposal beneath the relationship analysis and professional flattery. Daniel wanted to leverage our past connection to advance his position at Harrington, creating a special role that would elevate him above his peers and the normal organizational structure. "That's an interesting suggestion," I said carefully, "though it raises obvious governance concerns." "Which could be addressed through appropriate disclosures and oversight mechanisms," he countered quickly. "The point is, We have a unique opportunity to create value from our unusual situation. I resumed walking, considering how best to respond to his transparent attempt at manipulation. The Daniel of a week ago, before he knew my true identity, would never have proposed such a partnership. This wasn't about recognizing my capabilities. It was about salvaging his position through strategic alliance with the power he had only just discovered. "You know what's most interesting about this conversation?" I said finally. "A week ago, you were allowing your mother to introduce Melissa as someone who understands the hospitality industry in ways I supposedly didn't. Now you're proposing. We leverage my strategic vision and your implementation skills as complementary strengths." Daniel had the grace to look momentarily discomforted before recovering his composure. "I've learned a great deal in the past 24 hours, he offered. His tone carefully modulated to convey humility without weakness. "What you've learned," I corrected gently, "is that I have power you didn't recognize. That realization hasn't changed your fundamental approach, only your target. When you thought I was just your wife, you discarded me for a partner who better served your ambitions. Now that you know I'm your CEO, you're proposing a partnership that would serve those same ambitions." His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's an unfair characterization. I'm simply identifying a professional opportunity that could benefit Harrington." "No, Daniel," I said, stopping to face him directly. "You're attempting to leverage our past relationship to create special circumstances for yourself. The same way you've leveraged every relationship throughout your career, not for mutual benefit, but for your personal advancement." For a moment, genuine frustration broke through his carefully maintained facade. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "I'm trying to find a way forward here." "What I want," I replied evenly, "is for you to do the job you were hired to do, within the organizational structure that exists for every other property manager at Harrington. No special access, no bypassed processes, no preferential treatment. Even though we have a decade of history that could make us more effective together? That history is precisely why such an arrangement would be inappropriate," I countered. "Our professional relationship needs more separation, not less." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of genuine agitation. "So you're determined to keep me at arm's length professionally because of what happened personally?" "No," I corrected firmly. "I'm determined to maintain appropriate corporate governance regardless of our personal history. The same standards apply to you as to every other executive at Harrington." We had completed the lake loop, arriving back at the path that led to the main lodge. Daniel paused, visibly recalculating his approach as he had so many times during our marriage when his initial strategy failed to yield the desired outcome. "I understand," he said finally, his tone shifting back to professional courtesy. "Thank you for the clarity. I'll focus on my property responsibilities and the standard reporting structure." The easy capitulation was suspicious. Daniel never abandoned a negotiating position without securing some concession. But his expression revealed nothing beyond polite acceptance, his professional mask firmly back in place. "Is there anything else we need to discuss before tomorrow's departures?" I asked, maintaining the business focus he now seemed to prefer. "Just one thing," he said, his tone deliberately casual. "I received a call from Jordan Barrett at Meridian Hotels this afternoon. They're apparently quite interested in my perspective on boutique property development in the Pacific Northwest." The implied threat was clear. If Harrington wouldn't provide the advancement opportunities he sought, other hotel groups would. It was another familiar tactic, one he had deployed throughout his career when negotiations stalled, creating the perception of external demand to increase his internal value. "Jordan is excellent at identifying talent," I acknowledged, neither discouraging nor encouraging the implied opportunity. "You should always explore options that align with your career goals." My neutral response clearly wasn't what he had anticipated. Daniel studied me for a moment, perhaps searching for signs of concern or possessiveness that would indicate his leverage tactic had succeeded. "I'll see you at tomorrow's closing session then," he said finally, nodding a professional goodbye before turning toward the lodge. I remained by the lake a few minutes longer, watching his retreating figure and reflecting on the predictability of his approach. Even now, facing circumstances that had upended his understanding of our entire relationship, Daniel defaulted to the same manipulative tactics that had defined his career, creating artificial competition, leveraging relationships for personal advancement, positioning himself as uniquely valuable. The realization carried a certain melancholy, not for the relationship lost, but for the recognition that Daniel would likely never change. His fundamental approach to life, to relationships, to professional advancement remained constant regardless of external circumstances. The only difference was that now, finally, I could see his maneuvers with complete clarity, unfiltered by the performances we had both maintained during our marriage. As I turned toward my cabin, I felt not anger, but a profound sense of liberation. For 8 years, I had carefully managed Daniel's ego while building something substantial in the shadows. Now, stepping fully into the light of integrated identity, I no longer needed to diminish myself to accommodate his insecurities. Whatever manipulations he attempted going forward would be met with the clear assessment of a CEO evaluating an ambitious but flawed executive. Nothing more, nothing less. The game he thought he was playing had fundamentally changed. Daniel just hadn't realized it yet. The second day of the retreat dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn morning that made the Cascade Mountains famous. I woke early, reviewing departure logistics in my cabin while enjoying coffee on the small porch overlooking the lake. The serenity of the setting contrasted sharply with the tension that had defined the previous day's revelation and conversations. My phone chimed with a message from Tara. "Breakfast in progress. Everyone present except DC. Housekeeping reports he cleared out his cabin before dawn." The information wasn't entirely surprising. After our conversation by the lake, Daniel had always preferred strategic exits to sustained confrontation. Leaving early allowed him to control the narrative around his departure, rather than facing another day of adjusted power dynamics. "Any communication from him?" I texted back. Tara's response came quickly. "Email to HR at 5:23 a.m. with resignation letter attached. Cited unforeseen personal circumstances and professional conflict of interest." So that was his choice. Rather than adapting to the new reality, Daniel had opted for complete withdrawal, removing himself from a situation where he couldn't dictate the terms of engagement. It was consistent with his pattern. When manipulation failed to produce the desired outcome, retreat and regroup became his preferred strategy. I considered how to address his departure with the executive team. The situation required transparency without unnecessary drama, acknowledgement without amplification. After finishing my coffee, I drafted a brief message to Harold and Tara outlining my approach, then prepared for the day's closing sessions. The dining room hummed with conversation when I arrived for breakfast. Executives gathered in small groups, discussing the previous day's presentations and planned initiatives. Harold approached as I selected fruit from the buffet, his expression carefully neutral. "Our Seattle manager has made a rather abrupt exit," he noted quietly. "Anything I should be concerned about from last night's conversation?" "Nothing unexpected," I replied. Daniel explored the possibility of leveraging our personal history for professional advancement. When that approach wasn't successful, he opted for strategic withdrawal. Harold nodded, unsurprised. "And how do you want to handle this with the team?" "Transparently but efficiently. I'll address it at the beginning of the morning session, then move directly to business matters." The morning meeting began at 9 o'clock. The conference room arranged as it had been the previous day, though with one conspicuous empty chair. I opened the session with deliberate calm, addressing the situation directly. "Good morning, everyone. Before we begin today's agenda, I want to address a personnel matter. Daniel Chen has resigned from his position as manager of the Seattle property, effective immediately. He cited personal circumstances and potential conflicts of interest given the unusual situation that emerged yesterday. I paused, allowing the information to register with the assembled executives. A few exchanged glances, but most maintained professional composure, having already noted his absence at breakfast. Samantha Williams will serve as acting manager while we conduct a search for a permanent replacement. Our Seattle operations strategy remains unchanged, and all ongoing projects, including the renovation, will continue as planned. Unless there are immediate questions about transitional arrangements, we'll proceed with today's scheduled discussions. No hands were raised, though I suspected conversations would flourish during the coffee break. With a nod to Tara, I transitioned smoothly to the day's first presentation, effectively closing the topic of Daniel's departure. The remainder of the morning proceeded efficiently, with productive discussions of strategic initiatives and market positioning. If executives were curious about the personal implications of Daniel's resignation, they kept such thoughts private, focusing instead on the business matters at hand. By lunch, the initial curiosity had largely subsided, replaced by the professional engagement that characterized successful leadership retreats. As executives dispersed for the afternoon's breakout sessions, Harold joined me on the lodge's deck, where I had paused to review notes for my closing presentation. "Nicely handled," he commented, settling into the chair beside me. Though I must admit, I expected more drama from Daniel's departure. "Drama requires an audience," I observed. By leaving at dawn, he deprived himself of that opportunity. Harold nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Eleanor left quite the voicemail at the corporate office this morning. Something about underhanded business practices and manipulative deception. Priya forwarded it to legal, just in case." I smiled slightly at the predictable reaction. Reframing betrayal as victimhood is a Chen family specialty, it seems. "And you?" Harold asked with gentle concern. "Not the CEO managing an executive departure, but you personally?" The question caught me off guard. So few people in my life asked about my personal well-being separate from my professional performance. I considered it carefully, wanting to give an honest answer rather than a perfunctory reassurance. "I'm reintegrating," I said finally. "For 8 years, I maintained a deliberate separation between personal and professional identities. That division served its purpose, but it exacted a cost I didn't fully recognize until it ended." "The cost of compartmentalization," Harold nodded. "I've observed it in many successful people, though few maintain it as completely as you did." "The separation began as a practical necessity," I explained. "Female founders faced distinct challenges when I started Harrington, particularly young women in hospitality. The dual identity helped bypass certain barriers. But over time, it became something else, a way to maintain a marriage that functioned only when my husband believed he was more successful than his wife." "And now?" Harold asked. "With both the professional secret and the marriage ended?" I gazed out over the lake, considering the question. "Now I get to discover who I am without the constant performance, without moderating my achievements to protect someone else's ego, without dividing myself into carefully managed personas. It's simultaneously liberating and unnerving." Harold smiled with genuine warmth. "If it helps, those of us who have known, both versions have always seen the same fundamental person, brilliant, strategic, and remarkably patient. The integration won't change who you are, only how freely you express it." His words carried the weight of decade-long observation, offering reassurance without platitudes. I appreciated both the sentiment and its delivery, honest assessment, rather than empty comfort. "Thank you, Harold," I said simply, "for your perspective and your discretion over the years." As Harold left to join his breakout session, I remained on the deck a few minutes longer, reflecting on the swift, conclusive end of my marriage. Daniel's pre-dawn departure and resignation, without attempting further manipulation or confrontation, represented a clear acknowledgement that the power dynamics had shifted beyond his ability to control. For someone whose career and relationships had been built on carefully managed perceptions, the inability to shape this particular narrative must have been intolerable. My phone buzzed with an incoming email from Daniel's personal account rather than his now-defunct Harrington address. The subject line read simply, "Forward address for documents." The message itself was brief and impersonal. "Olivia, please direct any divorce-related documentation to the address below. My attorney will be in touch regarding settlement terms. I've instructed movers to collect my remaining items from the house next Tuesday between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. If this timing is inconvenient, please advise. Daniel Chen, 1122 Harborview Drive, Unit 908, Seattle, WA 98101. The sterile efficiency of the communication, no accusation, no emotion, no reference to our final conversation or his abrupt departure, was quintessential Daniel in retreat mode. When outmaneuvered, he defaulted to cold practicality, treating personal relationships with the same detached efficiency he applied to underperforming investments. I forwarded the message to my attorney with a brief note requesting standard divorce proceedings without punitive measures. Despite the circumstances of our separation, I had no interest in a vindictive settlement. The clean break Eleanor had, initiated with her public replacement announcement, would continue through an equally clean legal dissolution. As I prepared to join the afternoon sessions, my phone buzzed once more, this time with a text from Priya at the Seattle office. Eleanor Chen called twice, requesting meeting with Ms. Harrington regarding defamatory corporate actions. Declined. To elaborate when pressed for details. How would you like to proceed? The predictable escalation brought a small smile to my lips. Daniel might have opted for strategic withdrawal, but Eleanor apparently preferred confrontation, likely positioning herself as defender of his reputation to solidify her role in whatever narrative they were constructing together. No meeting. Necessary, I replied. If she calls again, direct her to legal for any employment-related concerns. For all other matters, my attorney's contact information will suffice. With that final communication boundary established, I tucked my phone away and gathered my materials for the afternoon sessions. The retreat would continue for another half-day, focused entirely on Harrington's future strategic positioning. Daniel Chen, both as executive and husband, had exited that future through his own deliberate choices. What remained was neither the compartmentalized CEO nor the carefully diminished wife, but simply myself. Integrated, clear-eyed, and finally free to build a life without artificial divisions or strategic compromises. The definitive break had come not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet certainty, the natural conclusion to a relationship built on performances that could no longer be maintained once the fundamental truth was revealed. As I walked toward the conference room, I felt lighter than I had in years, unburdened by the weight of dual identities and calibrated self-presentation. Whatever came next, professionally or personally, would be approached as my complete self, without strategic diminishment or calculated moderation. The marriage that had begun with calculated misunderstanding had ended with clarifying truth. In this, at least, there was a certain symmetry, a narrative consistency that even Daniel, with his appreciation for strategic positioning, might grudgingly acknowledge. 1 year to the day after Eleanor had introduced Melissa as my replacement at our anniversary dinner, I found myself back at the Riverview restaurant, not by sentimental design or painful coincidence, but because Harold had selected it for our quarterly off-site strategic planning dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stepped through the familiar entrance, but the sharp sting of humiliation that had once accompanied those memories had faded to a dull acknowledgement of life's curious symmetries. The restaurant had changed little. In the intervening year, the same ambient lighting, elegant decor, and attentive staff creating an atmosphere of understated luxury. What had changed profoundly was me. I walked through the space not as Daniel Chen's carefully modulated wife, but as Olivia Harrington, CEO of a thriving hospitality group and a woman fully comfortable in her own power. Ms. Harrington, the maitre d' greeted me with professional deference. Your party is already seated in the private dining room. As I followed him through the main dining area toward our reserved space, a familiar figure at the bar caught my eye. Not Daniel, as some novelistic coincidence might have dictated, but Eleanor. She sat alone, elegant as ever in a designer dress, absently checking her phone while apparently waiting for someone. Our eyes met briefly as I passed. Her expression shifted from surprise to careful neutrality, her chin lifting slightly in what might have been defiance or simple acknowledgement. I nodded politely without breaking stride, neither avoiding the encounter nor giving it more significance than it deserved. The executive dinner proceeded productively, Harrington's leadership team discussing expansion opportunities and technological investments with the engaged focus that had become our hallmark. I had rebuilt the executive ranks thoughtfully over the past year, promoting talent based on demonstrated capabilities rather than political connections, creating a team notable for both its diversity and its results. The Asian market's expansion is exceeding projections by nearly 15%, our new director of international development reported, a talented woman who had been overlooked during Daniel's brief tenure, but whose strategic insights had proven invaluable since her promotion. The board is extremely pleased with our performance this quarter, Harold added, particularly the innovation pipeline you've established with the Sustainable Design Initiative. The discussion continued, focused entirely on future possibilities, rather than past achievements. It was this forward orientation that had always driven me professionally, even when personal circumstances had required elaborate compartmentalization to maintain it. As our dinner concluded and executives began dispersing, Harold lingered behind, his expression thoughtful. Quite a year, he observed once we were alone. Evolution rather than transformation, I corrected gently. The vision was always there. What changed was simply who articulated it. Harold nodded, acknowledging the distinction. And personally, how has that evolution progressed? Integration continues, I replied honestly. Some days more successfully than others, but the performance aspects have largely fallen away. Good, Harold said simply. That performance was never necessary for those who truly saw you. As we made our way toward the exit, I noticed Eleanor still at the bar, now joined by a man I didn't recognize. Silver-haired, expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. They were clearly engaged in animated conversation, her gestures indicating the same forceful personality she had always displayed when advocating for Daniel's interests. The scene triggered not curiosity, but a moment of clarity. Eleanor following. Patterns I understood all too well, seeking to advance family interests through carefully cultivated connections. The difference was that her machinations no longer affected my life in any meaningful way. Outside, as we waited for our respective cars, Harold nodded toward the restaurant entrance. Wasn't that? Yes, I confirmed simply. Life's little symmetries. And Daniel? Any word on how he's faring in his new position? Advancing rapidly within a smaller sphere, I said. Regional director at Meridian within 6 months. He's always been skilled at navigating organizational hierarchies. What I didn't share was the brief email I'd received from Daniel 2 months earlier. Not an apology or attempt at reconciliation, but a carefully worded request for a professional reference regarding a potential investor who had mentioned knowing me. The message had been formal, almost aseptically so, with no acknowledgement of our shared history beyond a perfunctory, "I hope this finds you well." I had provided the requested information with equal professionalism, maintaining the boundaries his actions had established. His response, a brief, "Thank you for your assistance," suggested he had found some equilibrium in his new circumstances, though whether he had gained any insight from our unraveling remained unclear. Harold's car arrived first, and with a warm handshake, he departed for the evening. Left alone on the sidewalk, I found myself reflecting on the perfect circularity of the moment, standing outside the same restaurant where, 1 year earlier, Eleanor had orchestrated what she believed would be my public diminishment. The cool evening air carried hints of approaching autumn, the seasonal shift promising renewal after summer's heat. I breathed it in deeply, appreciating the moment's symbolism without being constrained by it. The past year had taught me that narratives were tools, not prisons, useful for making sense of experience but dangerous when they limited future possibilities. My own car arrived, the driver holding the door with professional courtesy as I settled into the back seat. My phone chimed with an incoming message, not from Daniel or anyone connected to my past, but from Claire Nakamura, the brilliant, sustainable design specialist I had recently recruited to lead Harrington's most ambitious environmental initiative. Breakthrough with the water reclamation system this evening, results exceeding all projections. Can we meet first thing tomorrow to discuss implementation across all properties? I smiled at the timing, the forward-looking message arriving precisely as I departed this place of completed history. Absolutely. My office, 7:30 a.m. Bring the full data set. As the car pulled away from the curb, I glanced back once at the restaurant, not with regret or nostalgia, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of distance traveled. The woman who had sat frozen in humiliation at that anniversary dinner no longer existed, not because she had been destroyed by public rejection, but because she had finally been integrated into something more complete. Eleanor had introduced my replacement exactly 1 year ago, never suspecting that her calculated cruelty would ultimately free me from the performance that had limited us all. In discarding me for someone who better served their purposes, she and Daniel had inadvertently catalyzed the integration I had avoided for years, the merging of my professional power with my personal presence. The true upgrade, it turned out, had been neither Daniel's new relationship nor my professional revelation, but simply this: the freedom to exist as my complete self, undivided and undiminished by others' expectations. As Seattle's lights blurred past the car windows, I opened my tablet to review Claire's preliminary findings, my mind already engaged with tomorrow's possibilities rather than yesterday's completed narratives. Eleanor had intended our anniversary dinner as an ending, the conclusion of a wife who no longer served her son's purposes. Instead, it had become a beginning, the first step toward a self no longer fragmented for someone else's comfort. The symmetry of tonight's encounter with Eleanor felt less like cosmic significance and more like simple closure, the final page of a chapter already concluded, allowing the story to progress toward what came next. And what came next, I realized with quiet certainty, would be shaped entirely by my own integrated voice, neither the carefully modulated wife nor the strategically hidden CEO, but the woman who had emerged from the intersection of both, carrying forward the wisdom each perspective had provided. Eleanor had orchestrated my public humiliation as a demonstration of her power. She could not have known that in doing so, she was actually returning mine, the power to exist completely as myself, without strategic diminishment or calculated performance. In the final accounting, her attempt to showcase my replacement had revealed something far more valuable: the recognition that I had never needed replacing at all, only the courage to stand fully in the light as exactly who I was. That courage, once found, had transformed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.